can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let me just start by saying that it was about 20 years ago when, as one of the historians who had recently contributed to the amicus brief in the case of Webster v. Reproductive Rights, that I participated on a panel at the AHA about exploring the role of women's history in public policy. And it was that panel that started me reflecting on the effort to apply the history of sexuality and the history of women to contemporary issues in the courts at the time, the issue of abortion. I first began to think then about a tension between legal advocacy and historical interpretation. And later, as one of a smaller group of historians who submitted an amicus brief in the sodomy case, Lawrence v. Texas, in 2003, I continued to think about the use of history in judicial opinions. And I talk about this in an essay in the collection that was just mentioned, in which I take the phrase that's often used in judicial opinions, the phrase, quote, history and traditions, that are lumped together very often as if they were the same thing, and suggest that we're conflating two quite different things when judges use that term. And the 2 points I think that history and traditions conflates is, on the one hand, tradition, the past as precedent, a kind of originalism, if you will. And on the other hand, the dynamics of history, or the dynamics of social change over time, a kind of constructionism, if you will. And I think that when lawyers and historians work together, whether the historian is the expert witness in a case, or whether they're working to develop an amicus brief, or when historians sign on to amicus briefs, sometimes we do emphasize historical precedents. The brief in Webster, for example, pointed out that abortion had not been criminalized by the founders of the American Republic. So it kind of jumps on the originalism bandwagon to say, this is recent, this criminalization. But sometimes we emphasize change over time. In the Lawrence brief, for example, which overturned the criminalization of sodomy, the brief explains the very modern emergence of both the category of the homosexual and thus of gay discrimination, which could not thus be timeless. In the same-sex marriage cases, historians have clearly stressed change over time. Indeed, I would say that a kind of master narrative has emerged within the body of the text of these amicus briefs, and in some historical testimony in cases now in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland, Washington State, California, and Iowa. And I realize that this master narrative is a counter-narrative to the one that you were referring to of the timeless marriage and the static marriage. But what comes out, and it follows on what you were saying about the Goodridge, is what I see as a dominant theme, that marriage, rather than a fixed tradition, is a fluid, ever-changing institution. And that the direction of change over the course of American history has been towards more egalitarian and more inclusive marriage policies. Prime evidence, some of which you just heard about, includes the decline of coverture as women have emerged as independent legal and political actors apart from their role as wives in marriage. And I just want to quote from one heading in the historian's brief in the Connecticut case. It read, quote, "The abolition of coverture has led to a legal system in which spousal rights and responsibilities are equal, mutual, and gender neutral." A second major argument for fluidity, as you heard, is the elimination of racial barriers to marriage. These are citations to court rulings that have overturned anti-miscegenation laws, particularly the Paris case in California in 1948, and of course the Supreme Court's decision in Loving v. Virginia in 1967. In 2003, for example, the Massachusetts Supreme Court cited this history to support same-sex marriage in the case of Goodridge versus the Department of Public Health. And I quote from that decision. "In this case, as in Perez and Loving, a a statute deprives individuals of access to an institution of fundamental legal, personal, and social significance, the institution of marriage, because of a single trait: skin color in Paris and Loving, sexual orientation here. As it did in Paris and Loving, history must yield to a more fully developed understanding of the invidious quality of the discrimination." End of quote. This narrative of expanding freedom in the briefs underlies the historical arguments in these same-sex marriage cases. I'd say that the briefs filed in various states tend to trace the particular path of this march towards freedom in the evolving laws of each state in which they're filed. The Maryland brief, for example, states, quote, "The march toward gender equality in marriage provides perhaps the best historical example of the role played by the Maryland courts in guaranteeing greater inclusion and equality in the marriage relationship." End quote. The Iowa brief, which rested on the state's history of equal protection, quotes the Lawrence decision as follows: "As the Constitution endures, persons in every generation can invoke its principles in their own search for greater freedom." Now, this depiction of marriage as a fluid and not static institution, one in which women and minorities have gained greater rights over time, has solid historical grounding. I think few would argue that marriage has not changed, nor dispute the decline of coverture or the decline of racial barriers to marriage in American history. At the same time, crafting historical arguments within the setting of a courtroom imposes certain constraints that do not usually impinge on the seminar room. And approaching this panel for this evening, I wondered how our teaching about the history of marriage or the history of sexuality